Okay, so when we're looking at Ecuador, what's a region for agricultural land is the most interesting to you? Kind of outside of Vilcabamba, because like you said, the prices are a bit higher in that region, but where are kind of the most interesting areas?
Yeah, so I think, to sort of step back a little bit, you kind of have to understand the terrain of the country a little bit. So, if you look there on the screen, the part that's to my right, the part away from the part east, the way away from the water is, that's the Amazon, right? And so most of that is uninhabitable. There's some sections of it that are on the border, right, between the Sierra, the mountains, and the Amazon region that are phenomenal for all kinds of things, including agriculture. But the vast majority of that region is dense Amazon, where nobody lives and nobody goes outside of some tribes and things like that. So you kind of have to just cut that whole section out, really, when you're talking about the country. And then you have the mountains, which tend to be very steep and hilly, right? So you don't have a ton of land there that you can use, even though there's some great agricultural areas. But a good chunk of that is is gone as well. And then you have the coast, which is very interesting for agriculture. It's much more populated on the coast certainly than most of the rest of the country. The entire country, right, is only the size of Colorado, landmass wise. So it's very small country with not all that much, flat usable land. Even though when you're here, it feels like the whole country is like that, right? Because that is what it looks like. But you kind of have to sort of, approach it from that perspective. And then going back to what I was talking about earlier with the infrastructure and the history of the country, you could only, for most of Ecuador's history, you could really only do large scale agriculture in a few places where you could get your products to port and to market. So because of those factors, the areas that are around Machala, for example, on the southern coast, these are very well developed for agriculture, right? You've got gigantic banana plantations there. They're growing a number of other things too, but it's mostly known for banana and some cacao. If you get up north, also on the coast, right, that's fairly well developed for agriculture. They're doing palm for palm oil. They do a lot of cacao, things like that. If you're talking about the Sierra, the mountains, it's mostly around Quito and just south of Quito that most of the agricultural production is taking place, right? So they're doing flowers and broccoli and apples and all kinds of stuff up there in those areas, the cooler weather crops. You get down in our region in Loja, right? That's known for coffee. It wins awards all over the world every year for coffee. However, again, we're in the mountains here, so most of these farms are very small scale. Outside of those areas, there's not a ton going on. There's very sort of small scale farming, very small, in different areas. That's all pretty much sold domestically. There are a few buyers who buy sort of all the crops of a region for export, but very few. And many areas all around the country are absolutely incredible for agriculture. So jumping back for a minute to let's start in the Orient, in the Amazonian region. You see right there on the screen Zamora, and you can go further south all the way to Zumba. And then that road, right, which runs the entire length of the Amazon, it's a highway, it's a great road, right? There's Zumba. That road to the right there of Zumba, that road runs all the way up to Colombia. And so it runs through, Lago Agrio, for example, is all the way up north, towards the border. And you're running through the Amazonian region where you have, generally speaking, humid-ish conditions. You go up and down in elevation and that changes, and you have all sorts of little nooks and crannies. Ecuador is the land of microclimates. If you get up north, it gets very hot. So you have really interesting areas up there for, all the tropical stuff. But really most of that region, right, most of the entire Amazonian region is still very, very, very inexpensive per hectare. And most of it does not have large scale agricultural operations going on. So you've got people who are doing 5 hectares of this, 10 hectares of that, but that would be pretty large scale for those regions, right? So really very small scale. So those are really fascinating regions to me for agriculture. Some of them have incredibly rich soil. You have no dry season in any of those areas. If you need a hot climate, you have that. If you need a cooler climate, you have that. Again, no shortage of water whatsoever. So those are, and labor everywhere is very inexpensive, and people here have a background in agriculture, almost everybody outside of the major cities. So the Amazonian region is really interesting for agriculture. You can still find, again, you can still find stuff in those regions, depending on how flat it is, depending on access, depending on other services, you know, between 1,000 and 5,000 a hectare, stuff like that, pretty commonly. If it's 100% flat and it's in more sought after areas, sure, the price can absolutely go up from there. But that range is still widely available.
Interesting. Then maybe touch on a little bit of like some high yield crops in potential opportunities that you see in the market. Because I know I discussed with you a little bit about this, but especially things like the berries, and then maybe some of these alternatives that are up and coming, like growing cannabis. They recently allowed you to kind of get the license in Ecuador. So maybe touch on a little bit of that.
The Amazonian region, again, for agriculture is very interesting. It's not highly developed there, but things grow really well. So any sort of tropical fruit, you can do there very well. People are even growing world-class coffee in some of these regions. Cacao grows very well there. And then all kinds of stuff. Ecuador is an interesting culture. It's sort of a monkey see, monkey do mentality in terms of business, right? So if somebody's doing something that's successful, everybody else starts doing that same thing. And so you end up with a situation where there's not a lot of variety to what people are doing entrepreneurially, and that also is true for agriculture. So Ecuador leads the world in certain things, is on the top of the lists, right, in export of shrimp and coffee and cacao and bananas and flowers and roses, I should say, and different things like that. Outside of those crops, there's not large scale production of a whole lot of things. So if you're a little bit more creative and you can look for some of those higher margin crops, both for domestic sale, but also for export, I think that's really interesting because your input costs here are much lower than they are in the developed world. And there's not a lot of agriculture is sort of a favored industry here politically. And so there's no minimum wage, for example, for your workers in agriculture. And you don't have to hold all kinds of insurances. There's very little overhead and sort of extra input costs when you're in agriculture here. So, and then there's all kinds of stuff on the domestic market that to me are very interesting, where they're very expensive in Ecuador comparatively, just because they're not grown, but there's climates that are great for them. And so, you're starting to see a few people here and there get into that. In fact, I was talking to a guy recently, a big company out of Spain, I think they're out of Spain, is doing 40 hectares of blueberries now. That's for export. And that's actually down in Zapotio, which I'll talk about shortly, but that's for export. And so, but there's all kinds of opportunities like that. Grapes are very expensive in Ecuador, really berries of all kinds, nuts are very expensive, kiwis, all kinds of stuff. Actually, I don't know if you can grow kiwis here in this climate, but also there's all sorts of things here that are very expensive that you can grow really well. Back to the Sierra for a second. The areas that to me are probably the most exciting are down by the Peruvian border. I mentioned Zapotio. That area to me for agriculture is number one on my list, certainly, and that's because it's really phenomenal growing conditions. The landscape looks a bit desert-like. To find, I don't even know if it's a small town. If you go to,
is it Zapotio?
Yep, Zappo. Yep, there it is.
Yep. Perfect.
Yep.
Oh wow, right there. Yeah.
Yep.
Zapotio. Wow. Okay, so this is one that you do find kind of interesting on the border.
Yeah, so Zapotio is fascinating. It's very hot during the day. It's not hot at night, so you get that nice temperature difference that the crops like. There's no such thing as clouds in Zapotio. So you get 13 hours of sun, 365 days a year. The soil is excellent, and it's relatively flat, that area. So you're not dealing with the mountains, and land is still very, very inexpensive. So I was visiting there recently. I think I mentioned earlier, visited a number of number of farms there that are doing really interesting numbers on a lot of different stuff, but most of that area completely undeveloped. There is not a ton of water there, so you do need to make sure you have access to water. But I mean, there's all sorts of properties there that border the river, and then they do have large irrigation systems as well for properties that don't. So it's certainly not an insurmountable obstacle. That's really probably for me in the Sierra and the mountains, the most interesting region. We looked at 100 hectares there, where they were asking 3,000 a hectare. That bordered the river and was already set up with reservoirs and pumps and the whole nine. So you can find those kinds of prices down there, which is fascinating. Again, from sort of an arbitrage perspective of producing something similar to like they're producing out in California, for I don't know, 10-15% or less of the input costs. The coast is really interesting too. Also undiscovered, like the value just isn't understood yet. Inland on the coast, right? So you have beachfront in Ecuador is really interesting too for living. There's all sorts of interesting and inexpensive beachfront in Ecuador. But if you're on the coast and you're looking at agricultural opportunities, again, I'm a bit of a contrarian. I would get away from Guayaquil and Machala. That's where things are already pretty well developed.
Manta as well. Manta has a lot of tourism, right? Like a lot of expats go in there.
Yeah, I mean, but from the agricultural perspective, the areas around Manta are interesting. But yeah, depending on where you are, because some of Manabí, where Manta is very, very dry. But it's very flat too, and there's other areas that do have water that are really interesting and incredibly inexpensive. But yeah, I would get away from Guayaquil, Machala a little bit, just because you can find those same conditions elsewhere, much less expensive. As you start to get sort of north of Guayaquil, really the entire rest of the country, inland on the coast, has A+ growing conditions and is inexpensive. So you've got hot and humid in much of those areas, not all of them. Again, some of Manabí province, where Manta is drier for sure. So you do have some areas where there's a dry season, but the vast majority of the coast is hot, humid. Inland, I'm talking about, is hot, humid, and inexpensive, and pretty flat. So there, again, you can grow just about anything. People are growing, there's shrimp farms all up and down. There's other crops I mentioned earlier. Cacao, Ecuador is one of the leading, it might be the #1 producer of cacao in the world. If it's not, it's right up there. They are the #1 exporter of bananas in the world. They're very high on the list for shrimp. I think they're #1 in roses. That's back into the mountains. But some of those areas inland on the coast, I mean, I've found stuff consistently, again, sort of in that, even a little bit, occasionally even a little bit under $1,000 a hectare, up to a few thousand, 5,000 or so. You can find stuff much more expensive than that, of course, but things that are really prime for agriculture. Now, of course, there's infrastructure costs, there's all kinds of other costs, to get into a project like that, but fascinating areas for producing, especially the tropical stuff, right? People grow a lot of coconuts in the northern coast, a bit in Manabí as well, in Zapotio as well. So in fact, I'm sitting here drinking coconut, which of course you won't see because you're sharing the screen, but in Zapotio, where I was mentioning earlier, that's where all the coconuts in this area come from Zapotio. So they do a lot of watermelon there, melons as well, same on the coast. They have tons of watermelon plantations. But again, a lot of these areas are just undeveloped. And so if you're exporting, right, if you have a project in mind and you want to feed the world, so to speak, you can really get going very inexpensively here.
Definitely. And I think some of those higher yield crops is what I was interested in. And then also, like you were touching on, is that it's not a monocrop place, right? It's in the US, where I grew up really, especially in the Midwest, It's all monocrop, right? Like Iowa, it's just corn. Nebraska is just corn. But at least here in Ecuador, there's truly an abundance of diversity. And one of those that I found kind of interesting, like you were talking about, were the berries. But then also recently they allowed it so you could actually get your license to grow cannabis, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And that's actually, we're in the process right now of getting our license. It's a very new industry here. So there's an interesting opportunity now to be one of the first movers in that. And, interestingly enough, it's CBD oil, for example, is more expensive here than it is in the States. And that's, again, because it's a brand new industry. So it's an interesting opportunity right now in that it's heavily regulated, but it's like everything in Ecuador, there's workarounds, and the regulation actually is not going to take effect for 5 years. So they're going to basically, they have these very strict regulations, and then you have 5 years to comply, and they'll change it 30 times by then, and it'll probably never be very heavily regulated. So it's interesting. Right now, you can get a license for the raw material, for making products, hemp products. You can also get it for the flowers that are turned into CBD oil, and you can also get it for processing that as well. So yeah, that is a really interesting opportunity right now in Ecuador.
Definitely. When I was staying in Banos, one of the hosts of this like farm, it was like Earth Day, and we're planting these tree tomatoes, and I was kind of asking him, what was this before the tree tomatoes? And he said he tried. It was about like 5 years ago to like grow in this kind of smaller plot a bunch of cannabis, and he grew it all. Like this French guy invested in it, but at the end he literally didn't know what to do with it, because there's like you said, number one, most people, the way that they get taught agriculture is just from their parents, so kind of what gets passed down is repeating the same things. But in that case, there's so much value you can add if you kind of come in with a little bit of knowledge and information, and utilize kind of this undervalued lands here.
Yep, no, exactly, 100%. And yeah, that's interesting that they're doing the tree tomato. So Banos is cool. That I haven't spent a lot of time there. I thought it was warm.
It's a little cool. Actually, the surprising thing is there's a lot of tree tomatoes. That's what I was kind of curious on. And I remember we had a call when I was there, but I kind of did a lot of looking around at land there. But everybody was kind of just copying what everybody else was doing. It's like all these farmers where there's this kind of abundance of lands, and it's like, I think maybe the mental model of working out, the prices in your head for this kind of large crop is easier with something like that. But with something like cannabis or kind of these other products that are more, I guess, basically you could grow them for very, very cheap there and then sell them, especially kind of in the US market or Canada, for a lot higher. Things like superfoods, in here, maca is very, very popular. Growing things like turmeric and these different kind of superfoods, and then selling them in the US where they're very, very expensive, I think is interesting.
Oh, I agree completely. One of my dreams, which I have not gotten to yet, is a large, organic superfoods farm that you process into product, for export, because
exactly, yes, yeah.
The market.
Oh my gosh, the cost of making a lot of those products. I mean, yeah, you were talking about coca, I guess technically considered to be one, coffee, but things like spirulina, moringa. There's what do they have here? It's some like purple corn. I think it's corn. I can't remember exactly how they say morada, maybe like something morada, but it's this purple corn that's kind of like a superfood. And when you buy it in the US, I remember looking at it, and it's crazy expensive. It's like a Kai powder, but what it costs here for like a pound of it comes to like $3 US. It's insane. And the opportunity there of like packaging that up in like something small where the packaging is nice, and then selling it in like, Whole Foods in the US is interesting.
Absolutely. And that would be an amazing thing to do in the Amazonian region. And you could produce all that stuff there. You could also, have a really interesting story, right, from the sort of heart of the Ecuadorian Amazon. And, there's a lot of indigenous tribes in those areas as well. And, you could do all kinds of great things for the economy. And it's a really interesting story.
Yeah, that's a great idea. But
the sort of pristine quality as well of the nature of the soil, of the water, of the air in that region, particularly because you do have the entire Amazon to the east of the edge of it where you'd be producing, would also be a really nice, sort of value add to the marketing picture.
Definitely. And I think, yeah, that's something, again, in monocrop cultures, like in the US or in Canada, the topsoil erosion is something that's a massive problem, and most people don't even realize. The topsoil erosion it's actually one of the biggest threats, right, for like global food production. And people don't really realize it when you're kind of using monocrop. It's a big problem. So kind of doing more permaculture based farming and having it be, yeah, organic first and kind of giving back to the land, I think is always important, but it's much easier to do. It's much more frictionless, in my opinion, in Ecuador than these other places where there's a ton of laws, regulations, all these things. Like you said, you can get things done a lot quicker, I think, in South America.
No, that's right. And on our projects, this just sort of our flavor. We kind of don't get involved in anything we're not really excited about it. So all of our agriculture stuff is organic. We don't necessarily label it as such. That depends on what we're doing and the scale and all that, and we'll see what we get into in the future. But yeah, we're not spraying anything. We really believe that there's ways to grow crops that actually have beneficial outcomes, even better outcomes over the long term than spraying them and using all the kind of chemical fertilizers and all that. And with what's going on right now in the fertilizer market and so on and so forth, that's proving interesting from that perspective as well.
Yeah, so much better. But yeah, thank you guys very much for your time. It was great talking with you today.